one of the questions that comes up frequently to me is, what is the intentional interim process? Several years ago, almost 50 now, Lauren Mead, who at that time had become the leader of an organization called the Alban Institute that was based out of Washington, D.C., did a study that talked about the change of pastors and some of the issues that were coming about. And one of those major issues was churches were not using the time during the interim in very positive manners. And because of that, many new pastors were coming in and being unintentional interims. They would come for 1 or 2 years and then have to leave pretty quickly because there was not a good match that had been made between the new pastor and the church. Some issues that had been identified, or sometimes even unidentified, really became very strong things that the church had to deal with, and the new pastor came in. After this study, several people joined together with Lauren Mead's impetus and began thinking about how could a process be put together to help congregations to really take an intentional effort of looking at itself and helping itself get ready between pastors, between that letting go and between that getting started new. And one of the things that was developed was a process called the intentional interim process. There was a group out of Baltimore, Maryland, that had developed an organization called the Interim Ministry Network. They began to put some training and some other things together. In North Carolina, the Center for Healthy Congregations, or Congregational Health, the Center for Congregational Health, that was a part of the pastoral care ministry of the Baptist Hospital of North Carolina, put together a process as well. And the Center for Congregational Health in North Carolina kind of became a leader in training pastors who were interested, especially as they were getting close to retirement, in how to lead a congregation through an intentional process. And here in Virginia, many pastors who were getting close to retirement began to attend seminars, training, preparation events that the center provided to really develop them. In fact, what they would do is almost spend about 85, 90 hours in training about what it would take to lead this process. To explain the process more, I thought I would share with you a video that the Center for Congregational Health put together a few years ago that kind of explains what's involved and what happens when a church chooses to bring in an intentional interim pastor. So watch this video. We'll talk about some things about it when it's concluded, but I hope this will give you an idea of what's involved in this particular process.
Life is a journey, a series of starts and stops, comings and goings, departures and destinations. The same is true in the life of a congregation. Things change, people come and go, including the minister. Intentional interim ministry is a powerful, positive process that helps congregations clarify identity and the way forward when a pastor leaves, supporting a faith community by serving as, well, a roadmap, guiding them as they prepare to call their new senior clergy, helping them get ready for the next step in the journey.
The biblical story is all about journey of God's people discovering God's will and purpose for them. Abraham, Moses, Deborah, Jesus, Paul, and Phoebe all were on journeys of hope and wholeness, faithfully seeking and following God's direction. Calling new clergy is a journey of hope and wholeness too, a journey the intentional interim ministry process has helped thousands of congregations around the world navigate since the 1960s. The intentional interim ministry process helps congregations share their feelings and create a spirit of excitement about the future. Even though it's been updated through the years to meet the needs of today's faith communities, the heart of the work remains the same: clarifying identity.
When a minister leaves, it's a whole new world for a faith community and a perfect opportunity to discover who we are and what God wants us to be now. But how do congregations get from here to here? It all begins here. When a pastor leaves, the congregation comes to a detour. Intentional interim ministry helps us move in the right direction by exploring 5 key elements of healthy faith communities: heritage, mission, leadership, connections, and future.
Every faith community is shaped by its past. The interim is a time to understand history and celebrate heritage. The intentional interim ministry process helps congregations get clear about what stays behind and what comes into the future. This is also the time to grieve, to bring closure with the former minister, and let go of old expectations, wounds, and patterns, so a new minister can be fully embraced.
It's healthy for faith communities to periodically review where they're going and why. In the interim, this process helps congregations look at why we exist, the mission statement, what we aim to accomplish, the vision statement, and how we live vision and mission day to day, our core values.
Leadership is action, not a person. The interim is the perfect time to talk about expanding the leadership base, reassessing professional staffing needs, and updating documents such as bylaws and job descriptions.
Connections is all about a congregation's relationships with the community and denomination. A time to ask, who is passionate about these relationships? How are we seen as a local citizen? How are missions monies collected? And what do we support?
The whole point of this discovery process? To blaze a trail to a new future together. To develop accurate, spirit-centered congregational and pastoral profiles that represent who we are here and now and fulfill God's purpose for us, preparing us for the next step in the journey, calling a new pastor.
Life in a congregation is a journey of the heart and spirit, being open to the will of God. That's what intentional interim ministry is all about, working with congregations in a relevant way to build a bridge from the past into the future, helping you emerge from the self-discovery process as an even stronger and more effective faith community. And it works. A 9-year study of hundreds of congregations and thousands of lay leaders and clergy revealed that 2 years after participating in the process, more than 90% of the congregations remain healthy and would recommend the process.
Is your congregation calling a new pastor and ready for an exciting and empowering journey of discovery? Go to healthychurch.org to learn how the intentional interim ministry process can help you.
Now, with this video, you see the orientation of this intentional process for a church to look very carefully at who it is, that grabbing that sense of identity, finding that sense of direction. Now, the Center for Congregational Health out of Winston-Salem is the organization that has trained most people around this process. There are other places that have trained around this process as well. As I mentioned earlier, the Interim Ministry Network out of Baltimore, Maryland has trained a good number of people. We have a partner in the Baptist General Convention of Texas, and they have a person on their staff that specifically trains around the intentional interim process. His name is Carl Fickling. And so these are the three places that we have seen that people are trained as intentional interims. Now, the suggestion is, if you're interested in this type of process, first, you would take it before the church to agree to do the intentional interim process. Let the church agree that it's a process you will use for this time. Almost all the training that I have seen and have heard have made this to be a very important part of the process. And the key thing is for church buy-in, because to do this process, the church has to understand and be willing to be a part of the conversations around these 5 areas of heritage, mission, leadership, connections, and future. And it's going to be very important to whoever the intentional interim pastor is that the church has agreed to do this particular process. So that's first thing. Once you've agreed, then the second thing is to begin looking for that intentional interim pastor who will be a help to you. My own interpretation of this is that the key ingredient in this whole process is who your intentional interim pastor is. Just about every one of the intentional interim pastors that I'm aware of at this time are, well, they're involved in a church somewhere. In Virginia, we have a group of retirees who have trained in this process and helped churches all over the place. The challenge is getting the right person that connects well with your church. And what I always encourage any church is, as you're thinking about this process, think about it carefully, what's involved in the process, and then be very careful about who you select. Some churches choose to have, as I said in the different approaches conversation, some churches choose to bring in somebody who can be both the intentional interim minister and do the study of these 5 areas that were talked about in the video. Some choose to have somebody being the pastor and somebody else to come in and lead the study and to look at the history, the heritage, look at the mission and connection and leadership, and then help to prepare for the future. The key ingredient in this whole process is do your research on persons who are available and how they would connect with your church. If there is a poor connection between the pastor, the interim pastor, or the facilitator that you might bring in to do this study, if there's a poor connection, it will mean that probably your results are not as good as you want them to be. So do your due diligence. Check references, check and see where they have served before. You can make calls to the Center for Congregational Health or calls to us here in Virginia. There's an organization here in Virginia as well called the Virginia Network of Interim Ministers that you can find, and I'll put their website here in the materials that I'm doing. These are guys who gather for fellowship and training, for helping each other as they're thinking through this process. Many of them have been trained in the intentional interim process from either the Winston-Salem group, the Center for Congregational Health, or they have been trained by the Interim Ministry Network. So that's the process. It's an involved process. Whether it's successful or not has a lot to do with how well the church is willing to work with that intentional interim or with the intentional interim facilitator to make the process work. Now, there are other processes that can create intentionality in the church as well, and we'll talk about them in terms of some other things as well. But the key thing is, find a pastor who will lead you through an intentional study of yourselves, how you relate to the community, how you relate to each other, and use that as a way of springboarding you into this new relationship with a pastor.